So, let's go for a short couple of minutes.
Securing it down.
Logan waited for us and walked
We've got enemies incoming. I could use this. Oh yeah! Oh yeah, locked and loaded. GR1 marked! I'm bleeding out! Shit, yeah! Hang on! I'm coming! Revive me! I'm bleeding out! Back to the south. Bring it! Sucks to be you! I am in the zone! Drone down! Revive me! Let's do this! All done. Dead.
Hey, we've got 30 seconds to regroup.
Weapons locker upgraded. Oh yeah! Time's up!
Okay.
Locked and loaded.
Drone down!
Weapons locked and deployed.
Oh hell yeah!
down.
I see you! All tight! Let's do this! Heavy! Bye-bye, shithead!
We've got 30 seconds for reinforcements.
Securing the town. Hey, we should secure that energy town.
Help me secure the town.
Oh, yes!
Time's up.
Here they come! Oh, yeah! Incoming flashbang! Throw down! Good to go! Damn it! Down! Yeah! Fight left! Whoa, flashbang! Shit! Yeah!
Nice work, Gears. Now rebuild and get ready for more.
Energy select.
We feel so fresh and just pampered.
Here they come.
Throwing shock! Shock out! I got a jump! Order!
So we've done If you overuse it, then you can get quite annoying, especially around here, but when it's not necessary. Some extra and then
Securing the tower. Locked and loaded. Yes.
Time's up. Here they come.
Sentry reloaded.
Are you kidding me?
Still want. Shop.
Locked and loaded.
Time to take a damage.
Tag destroyed. Let's re-secure it. Bring it.
Send the side into the skin.
Down they
And
go.
it goes on.
Good work. That's nearly destroyed. Ah, bullseye, baby. Oh, hell yeah. Tag destroyed. Let's re-secure it. Four left. Throw down. Ooh, I can use that. Okay then.
Securing the tower.
Help me secure the tower. Cleared for launch. Love it. Here comes the shithead brigade. Decoy destroyed.
Let's do this! All good. Lock and load!
Love it. One dead throw.
Stupid gun! Hey, stop it! Not intentional!
Precision kill.
Carmines were born for this!
So almost done. basically treats
Place decoy where you want.
Eat some stirring shots.
Something's wrong with this thing. It keeps jamming.
It's blue, chamomile, vanilla,
Ammo secured.
That's it. Put it forward. Now refill.
looping bunny certified. I believe that the plastic also recycled.
2K.
When you first start using them, maybe you'd have them a little longer than you'd used to. setting them because you don't want to put them in too far. Once you're like so used to it and you know how far to put them in, then cause any damage then, and you move enough in order to take them out. So to take them out, just pinch them, roll them, and just ease it out gently. So you just take this, roll it,
Good shot!
turn it around, so
Oh yeah, locked and loaded. Lock and load!
it's them straight.
Why are you shooting
Hold
at me?
down the reload, so you can just press it, and then it expands.
Oh yeah!
Come on, man, get the fuck up.
Oh, my bad.
Those two sides. And
Oh yeah! Oh yeah! Let's do this! Hold up. Ah, bullseye, baby!
You're a lifesaver. Yeah, what I need.
Slide through! Fire in the hole! Nice! Good splatter factor! Oh yeah! Take it! Right left! Let's do this! Drag him out! Oh, got some early!
honestly, like, absolutely amazing.
Nice!
Soft, glowy, beautiful skin. You're going to have such a good night's sleep.
45.
Sleep all the way through. Lovely, gentle,
Sentry reloaded! Hands up! Let's do this! Head down! Back in your hole!
secure the tap. Enemy tap nearby. Let's secure it.
Weapons locker upgraded.
Thanks.
Barrier deployed!
Drop down! Down! Let's do this! In your face! Fire in the hole! Throwing frag! Frag out! Lock and load! One dead drone! Your time is up!
This is right.
Drop dead.
I am in the zone!
Woo! Nice work.
Sentry reloaded!
Mine up the phone. Definitely. She's
Tap theory deployed.
Oh yeah! Sentry upgraded.
Here they come.
Sentry reloaded. Good to go. Oh, hell yeah! Oh, yeah! Stop it! Stop it! Let's do this! That's right! You again!
Half theory destroyed.
Fuck you! Open your eyes, idiot! Yeah!
Take the fire.
Bring it! Oh, my bad! Stupid son! Hey, moron! I'm on your side! Yeah! Slow down! Oh yeah, locked and loaded.
Move it. Embedded placement.
Who's next?
got 30 seconds to regroup.
During attack.
Sentry reloaded.
Energy tap available. Let's secure it.
Sentry reloaded.
We've got company.
Weapons locker deployed!
Zone!
Medallion attack!
You are scared! Oh yeah! Good to go! What's your name? Got it. Down they go! Whoa, flashbang! I am in the zone! Yeah! Let's do this! Scratch one, drop right frag! Fire in the hole! The fuck?
We've got 30 seconds to reinforcements.
Oh man, shit. Ammo group. Is that ammo? That is that.
Sentry reloaded! Barrier repaired! Let's do this!
Yeah.
Shit, yeah!
Sentry is empty! Sentry deployed.
$500 in frags.
Throwing energy tap.
Oh yeah, locked and loaded.
Where you go? We ain't done yet.
Shit, yeah! Oh, yeah! Just what I needed.
You gotta be kidding me.
Locked and loaded.
If I hadn't known he was this broken.
Oh yeah!
Tap empty. Energy tap upgraded.
Help me secure that tap.
No players.
Securing the tap.
Barrier deployed.
So awesome. You just put as much wire as you wish. Okay, smash it. I gotta start now. I don't have my ultimate. Okay, I don't have my ultimate. I can't feel them. Well, we do have a decoy. Decoy, how long is it gonna last?
Incoming flashbang!
Oh, when I headshot, I actually get my return.
Throwing shock.
Not sure if face.
Yeah.
Revive me!
Oh, really? I can actually get my return.
Shock out.
Okay, now I got my ultimate.
Hang on!
guy didn't get here for a while. There we go.
I'm coming!
That's the thing. Yeah, I don't see that.
Let's do this! Hold it. Secure energy tower!
I don't know why we're here.
No! Got some! Get him! Accident, I swear! Nice! Yes!
Nice work, Gears. Now rebuild and get ready for more.
I like to use the pointer. I shouldn't use that one at all.
Oh, yes!
Some damage. Oh, shit. Oh.
Got it. Sentry reloaded! We can do this! No matter how much shit they throw at us!
This'll do.
Don't even move anything. I don't even have a fire. I mean, you do have some fire. only 2 barriers. I'm having a blast with all these things.
Who did that?
I guess I'm using too many barriers for myself.
Frag! Yes!
I mean, those are leaks. I see leaks with them.
Weapons level deployed.
Nice!
Ready to get my groove on.
Sentry reloaded! Shit! Ammo secured!
Yeah, suicide.
Nice! Good to go!
The whiskey?
Yes!
During energy test.
Oh, come on!
Mine doesn't.
I am in the zone!
No. Yeah.
Tab empty. Energy tab.
Sentry deployed.
Sentry reloaded.
We got enemies incoming!
Oh yeah!
Sentry deployed!
Tap taking damage.
Let's do this! Void frag! Drop down! Oh yeah! I'm down! Let's do this! Horde! Frag out! One jet drone! Shit yeah!
Who did that?
Let's do this! Oh hell yeah! Sentry reloaded! Great! Yes!
That's what we provide resulting that this substance here is going to sign so now we're going to do here analytics. We'll go to the evaluation line. Now we're going to start the evolution build. Start giving the evolution build and go to the edit, type downstream CL space start. On the right, I'm going to select an existing user and I put it down as dot server init. Configure for user C.
Okay.
If you need to pause, tell me. I'll wait. Yeah.
Lock and load!
5 minutes and under.
These approximated those of all the rest of us living here. So the particular value of the Niho-san study was to say the Japanese are not defended against American diseases by being Japanese. It's not Japanese genes that are protecting them. Because the people that wound up in mainland America had the same genes that they started with. But they had our diet, they had our lifestyle, and they wound up with all of our diseases.
Not RN.
I'll dovetail onto that with Ornish's studies, and certainly I guess one of the sayings you may have heard before is
Maybe
our
later.
genes determine, may affect our risk of disease maybe 5%. The rest is determined by diet and lifestyle, so it's really diet and lifestyle. The genes may load the gun, but diet and lifestyle pull the trigger. And Ornish's studies, he did, you're very familiar with Dean Ornish's studies on the lifestyle heart trial in 1990 and heart disease reversal. But he also did a series of studies beginning in 2005, another in 2008, and carried them on looking at men with prostate cancer and what would happen if they were provided with a similar kind of diet and lifestyle he used in the lifestyle heart trial. And one of the first things that was reported is that that basically genes could be turned on or off by changing your lifestyle. So your genes are not your destiny, if you will, but the way you
Gunna,
live
LVL,
can
2 century first.
cancer preventative type genes and turn off cancer promoting genes. And this was quite a revelation, I would say, at the time. And he went on to show that you could also affect the length of these little things at the ends of our chromosomes called telomeres, which essentially predict our longevity. And of course, as we age, one would expect the length of these telomeres would get a little shorter. And in fact, what happened when these folks were put on this diet and lifestyle program is they actually got slightly longer. So you could actually again, change your destiny by changing your lifestyle. I think these studies were very important, and they opened a lot of doors for scientists in terms of looking at health and disease a little differently.
I want to give a shout out to David Katz. I was in Honolulu 2 weeks ago lecturing for the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii, and they spoke about the Neo-San study, and I thought it was a Japanese word that meant great sushi. And I realize now it's Honolulu, San Francisco, and I thought it was Hiroshima, but Nagasaki. You know everything, and I sit at the feet of David Katz. Anyways, I will happily tackle Finland. You heard, if you were at Dr. Will's talk, he mentioned the venerable name of Ansel Keys, PhD, because he had 2 of them, and studies he did called the 7-country study that launched in 1958. One of the sites picked to compare dietary patterns versus other societies like Crete, like some American communities, was East Finland, called North Karelia. East Finland and North Karelia, it's confusing. But it was known to be a pocket of potential heart disease and a very high-fat diet, specifically as they evolved the study, high-saturated fat diet. And it turned out by the late 60s, about 10 years after the 7-country study was launched, that it was pretty clear that the highest heart attack rate in the Western world was in East Finland, abutting Russia. And their diet was very heavy in sausage and very heavy in butter, and had a saturated fat rate that approached 30% of calories were from saturated fat. To the point that 40, 45, 50-year-old men were having heart attacks at a rate unprecedented. And when men have heart attacks, they often just drop dead. It's a special thing we do better than women. Many gifts we have to end up dying earlier than women. So there was this massive public health study. They found this guy with the cutest name of Puka Peska, an MD in the public health sector, young man who took on the onus of going to food companies. Can we sneak beans in the sausage? Let the women know. God forbid, don't tell the men when they go out in the fields. Can we, change the butter to margarine on the store shelves? They did recommend quitting smoking. That sometimes gets brought up as a criticism. It wasn't just the food. It was a comprehensive lifestyle change. And within 5 years, the heart attack rate had dropped 80 to 85%. Well, if you live in West Finland, you say that would be part of it, so they extended the study to the entire country, and they ultimately showed, and it continues to this day, major and significant reductions in heart attack rates, but it's extended to overall lifespan and certainly cancer cases too, not 80 to 85%, but cancer is somewhere in the 50% or so range. So, many of us point to it as one of the most instructive public health measures by changing diet to really change measurable and important lifestyle measures. There's this beautiful graph of just drop in heart attack rates over 5 years. So, North Karelia. David, perhaps the Annals of Internal Medicine has
sabotaged.
Got you got
I don't know. So great answer by Joel. Just to append something. So the North Karelia study is currently run by Puka Peska's successor, Erkki Vartiainen, and we were privileged. I met Erkki in Lithuania. We were privileged to actually have him come over and speak at the American College of Lifestyle Medicine meeting. So the story is beautiful, and it lasts a very long time. Over a span of almost half a century, rates of heart disease in North Karelia dropped 82%. Average life expectancy went up a full decade. One of the more stunning examples of community-wide effective public health intervention in the world. But, alas, this age of alternative truth, social media echo chambers, misinformation, and the well-funded machinations of the beef industry have caused the Finnish to begin doubting all the things that Americans are doubting. So, maybe meat is really better for me, right? Big fat surprise and all of that. So Erkki reported that actually
appreciated, not required.
All those many years of stunning and luminous benefit from their intervention, that young Finns were starting to increase their intake of meat and their intake of saturated fat. And for the first time in half a century, they saw the mortality curve going back up. We have to be very careful never to take for granted the gains that we've achieved, because famously, familiarity breeds contempt. We're seeing that, by the way. I don't know how this audience is going to feel about this comment. I will take my chances just the same. It's clearly off topic, but we're seeing that with vaccines. Vaccines are one of the more stunning advances in all of public health history. And yet, when you get comfortable with the fact that you don't have to worry that your kids are going to get poliomyelitis every spring when nobody gets smallpox, you start to worry more about vaccines than the dreaded diseases that vaccines prevent, until you get a new dread disease like the coronavirus, and then everybody's wondering when there'll be a vaccine. But we tend to do that. We get complacent about our gains, and then we start to shift our perspective until we're imperiled again. So sadly, some of those gains in North Korea are imperiled.
Can I ask you? I was at that lecture where they talked. I was interested in, and maybe you could one of you to comment. They were so. It seemed like they thought that the margarine shift was the biggest part of that. I was very impressed at the ACLM meeting that they were all into how the margarine seemed to shift. And the other thing I wanted in this change that I knew was happening, they seemed to say that there was an abutting area in Finland that was eating mainly meat and doing better than North Korea. That's how it started. Do you know if there's any truth to that?
So I just have the benefit, Joel, of having been at the lecture. So as Joel mentioned, they did a lot of things. So they focused on reducing smoking. They focused on reducing sodium intake. They focused on reducing saturated fat. And then much of the replacement was with polyunsaturated fat from plant sources. Honestly, I think if they had reduced saturated fat with any healthy alternative, they would have witnessed much the same benefit. But I think Berkey and others were kind of subscribed to the Mediterranean diet notion. So, I think Ansel Keys, by the way, everybody associates his name with a low-fat diet. He practiced a Mediterranean diet. He advocated for a Mediterranean diet. He really was focused on reducing saturated fat. So,
and way outlived all of his critics.
Yeah, absolutely. But Pukka Peshka and Erkki Vartanen were sort of disciples of Ansel Keys, so I think they may have had an early focus, Joel, maybe you can speak more to this, on benefits of replacing saturated fat with unsaturated fat. That was the purpose of the margarine, and obviously this was not trans fat containing margarine.
GRMN, don't fight.
They were very proud.
Ask if need locker.
They did achieve multiple changes in lifestyle. I think I agree with Joel. I think that's a good thing. At the end of that, you're not able to say, okay, how much exactly of this benefit was related to salt versus saturated fat versus tobacco. Yeah. But they sort of lined up all the bad stuff, knocked it all down, and added 10 years to life expectancy. You sort of say after that, who cares?
Who cares?
Right?
Yeah.
It was all bad. They fixed it all.
Okay, I'd like to ask another set of questions. And I'll try to answer each one in 3 minutes. Okay, first question. How much protein do we need? For growing children, what should they eat to make sure they get enough protein? Is there a way that we could not get enough protein? Are you positive that kids and adults don't need animal products to get enough protein? It's a funny thing. I am definitely brainwashed. In other words, I'm 100% plant-based, and I'm still every now and then, if someone says it loud enough, I think, I don't know, that's what I was told when I was little. And it's been answered 100 times, but it still sometimes seems like something I'm not confident in. Number 2, do you recommend cholesterol-lowering drugs in any cases? Why or why not? Question 3, how does human anatomy compare with those animals that are designed to eat other animals, like a lion, versus those that are designed to eat plants, like an elephant? Question 4. Thomas Seyfried, professor at Boston College, spoke last year at the Real Truth About Health conference. He said that glucose and glutamine were the foods of cancer. So does that mean we should avoid all glucose, and how would we even avoid glutamine if we wanted to? Question 5. A lot of what you're saying about prevent weight loss, about obesity, diabetes, heart disease, seems to make sense. But what about dementia? Will lifestyle prevent Alzheimer's the way it prevents heart disease? And question 6 is, what is candida, and how do you get rid of it? So the questions again, the first one was, getting enough protein. The second was cholesterol-lowering drugs. The third was how does human anatomy compare with those animals that are designed to eat other animals. Fourth was Thomas Seyfried saying the foods of cancer are glucose and glutamine. Question 5 was how do you prevent dementia? And question 6 is what is candida and how do you get rid of it?
I'll go first and I'll talk about Dr. Seyfried's lecture and his work. And I have written a lot about this. I invited Dr. Seyfried to speak for the first time at one of our conferences about, I think it was 4 or 5 years ago, and Dr. Campbell was the speaker also. And as soon as I announced it, you know, I get a lot of hate mail and nasty comments, and some of it's amusing, some of it not so much, but people are like, I can't believe you invited Dr. Seyfried to come and speak with Dr. Campbell, and how can you put these two people together, and they're diametrically opposed, and they don't have the same ideas, and are you going to become a paleo person? I mean, it was just absolutely insane. Like, I got close to 1,000 emails like this. Well, the first thing that I'll tell you is that the Saturday night of our conference, Dr. Seyfried and Dr. Campbell were in my hospitality suite till 2:30 in the morning talking. It's one of the most interesting conversations I've ever heard. They're not as diametrically opposed as you might imagine. I went home that night. I thought, you know, if I die in my sleep tonight, this is the way I'd like to spend the last few hours of my life. It's very interesting. But Dr. Seyfried's work is based on Otto Warburg's research in the 1940s. He was a Jewish researcher in Germany, and the reason why he didn't end up in the camps is because Hitler had a polyp on his vocal cord and thought he might need some cancer researchers sometime, so he never sent the Jewish cancer researchers, some of them to the camps. So anyway, he toiled away in Nazi Germany and made a discovery that all cancer cells were the same regardless of where they were located in the body, and that they all took up glucose at a more rapid rate. They didn't respire normally. So, speed ahead, and a guy by the name of Peterson picked up Warburg's work at Hopkins, and then Seyfried picked it up. And he wrote a very interesting textbook called Cancer as a Metabolic Disease. And one of the things that he talks about in the book is the potential for managing cancer, some types of cancer, the way that you manage type 1 diabetes. You die with it, not of it, handled properly, you could live till the end of your life. And he's focused on people who have forms of cancer that people don't have long enough to live to use alternative approaches or integrated approaches or just diet to try to resolve. So if you have slow developing chronic lymphocytic leukemia, you can often eat your way out of it. We have a lot of people who have. But if you have glioblastoma, you're likely to be dead in 8 months, and there's just not enough time to do much, and the treatments don't work. You're going to be dead in 8 months whether you get the treatments or not. And he's been successful in using a ketogenic diet with some of these people who have literally death sentences. And one of his patients, he reported on a case report when he was in Columbus about a patient who lived for 7.5 years after her diagnosis of glioblastoma, that just doesn't happen. He's got quite a few like that now. And he set up an institute to work with doctors who want to learn how to do this. So I think the point is that we have to make sure that we're looking at the application of diet to cancer without such a one-size-fits-all lens. I talked about that last night. I think it's important that we not do what medicine has done, which is try to slot everybody into this. If you have this is what we do for all cancer patients, this is what we do for all heart patients. So when I'm dealing with somebody who has terminal cancer, if treatments don't work, you don't have very long to live, I think that Seyfried's approach is a reasonable approach. When you've got somebody who has stage 2 breast cancer, I think that would be insane. Okay, so I think that there's a lot more I could say about it. And, you know, I could probably talk to you for 3 or 4 hours, but Steve will have tranquilizer darts to keep that from happening. So we'll just leave it that there's a lot of legitimacy to using certain strategies that deprive cancer cells of glucose for very long periods of time. And that is not diametrically opposed to the way that we would approach a person with cancer that is far less aggressive at a much earlier stage.
If anyone moves forth more than 2 steps, kick them.
We have to look at different things, but I think Seyfried has 2 patients that have been successful. No more than 2. I think he's got an N of 2, which to me is not science. I attended you guys have seen me do this before. I attended a lecture of his where I just was like, oh my God, this is ridiculous. Because it was such speculation an anecdote on 2 people. Most of it was rat studies. It's based on this idea that cancer cells, first of all, you can't extrapolate treatment of cancer to prevention of cancer. Those are 2 different things. Secondly, he's done nothing to prove
No,
the
because
effectiveness
accident.
of his treatment except provide 2 anecdotal reports. So what I see a lot of time in researchers, I think we all see it,
Emoting.
is where they lose the forest for the trees. Definitely cancer cells depend on cancer. He may be right, but I'd like to see a little bit more evidence before it's taken by the vast public to say, oh my God, sugar is the cause of cancer, because that's not true.
Well, I have to respond to that, okay?
Yeah.
I've listened to his lectures for a long time. He was at our conference last year also. And he spent about 90 seconds of the 2 hours he talked on those 2 patients. So there's a lot more to this than that. His textbook is 400 pages with 3,000 references, and I think that before we get into the weeds about it, people should read that book, all right? It's tough to read, it's really
It's
technical.
very in the weeds.
It is in the weeds, but the point that he's making, I think that we have to step back and look at the point that he's making.
No.
He actually talks about plant-based diets in that
He
book.
did, and in the conference I went to, I started asking these things because I said, well, come on, IGF-1 stimulates cancer. Yeah, oh, yes, it definitely does. But you're telling people to eat meat. No, I'm not telling people to eat meat. Yeah, I think it gets lost in the message, though.
But the other thing, too, is that in the United States, he is working on doing a study, but in the United States, an IRB is never going to approve a study that randomizes glioblastoma patients to a keto diet versus radiation, which will kill them. So everybody who's making interesting discoveries, we have Dr. Koh coming to our conference this fall. She's another one who's been ostracized by the cancer community. If you have an interesting idea for cancer that has some promise, you're never going to get a chance to try it in this country. So the only thing that you can do, look at what Esselstyn did. He never could have gotten his study approved either. So he basically said, listen, if you show up and say you want me to help you with diet and cardiovascular disease, I'd like to be able to use your data. Okay with you? All right, great. So we don't have to randomize. And of course, he gets beat up all the time because there's no control group either. Well, the control group is what happens to people who don't do this. And in the case of glioblastoma, they're all dead. If anybody lives, it's an anomaly, right? So what he's basically doing is training doctors around the world to do this, where there's a lot more freedom to practice differently, and also making the information available, hoping that enough people on their own might do it, and then submit their case reports to join the others. And that's the only way he'll ever be able to prove it. But the basic premise of what Seyfried is talking about is that all cancer cells are the same. They respire abnormally, and if you treat that, and there are different ways of treating it, including fasting, he talks about fasting, intermittent fasting to potentiate chemotherapy. We've used that with a lot of people with great results. A keto diet for somebody who's various ways to address the metabolic abnormality of cancer cells. So I agree with you that there are limitations to his work, but they're not self-imposed.
I just want people to understand that there's a difference between hypothesis and theory. Those are 2 different things.
Well, I understand that, but if you're the person with glioblastoma, you don't really care much about that. You're just looking for something that might help you, because nobody in oncology's got any ideas to do with this.
Yeah, but the problem I have with Seyfried is not that. It's not the glioblastoma patient. It's the extrapolation of his work to this whole support of ketosis diet and some kind of idea that ketosis prevents cancer, which it does not do. Yeah, and so that's what really bothers me. And besides, if you really want to look at evidence-based research for a nutrient fueling cancer, there's much more evidence for methionine fueling cancer than there is sugar. Very good studies, prospective, randomized trials in conjunction with chemotherapy, but very strong evidence of methionine, which is very heavy in animal products.
Right, and remember that the keto people are grasping for anything that they can, including the misinterpretation of other people's work. All right, they misinterpret campus work.
Right. We could talk about it and say, oh yeah, this is interesting. They misinterpret that and take it as ketosis prevents cancer.
Right.
As we're going to say, it's been a long time since I watched Saturday Night Live and that kind of back and forth on the news. Jane Curtin and such.
I was starting to think the same. That was good discussion. Well, let's shift to something less controversial. People are not lions, and people are not horses either. So I was in the Game Changers and corresponded significantly with the directors and producers. And, you know, overall it's very good. Documentaries, though, are about making a point. And when you're making a point, particularly when you're trying to rectify a misperception,
randomized trials
Thanks.
in conjunction with chemotherapy, but very strong evidence of methionine, which is very heavy in animal trials.
Right, and remember that the keto people are grasping for anything that they can, including the misinterpretation of other people's work. All right, they misinterpret camels.
Right. We can talk about it and say, oh yeah, this is interesting. They misinterpret that and take it as.
Right.
As we're going to say, it's been a long time since I watched Saturday Night Live and that kind of back and forth on the news. Jane Curtin and such.
I'm starting to think the same. That was good discussion. Well, let's shift to something less controversial. People are not lions, and people are not horses either. So I was in the Game Changers and corresponded significantly with the directors and producers. You know, overall it was very good. Documentaries, though, are about making a point. And when you're making a point, particularly when you're trying to rectify a misperception, and in the case of the Game Changers, the misperception is if you want to be badass, you've got to eat meat. If you want to be big and strong, you've got to eat meat. If you want to be a supreme athlete, you have to be omnivorous. That's false. You can fuel the supremes of human performance on a plant-exclusive diet. So I think the movie made that point very effectively. But when you're making a point, sometimes there is a tendency to tell just part of a full story because that part better makes your point. So, any of you see it? Game Changers? So, you know, there's the segment in the middle where they're talking about anatomy and they compare the human anatomy to a lion and the lion's GI tract is shorter and all of that. And, okay, we're not lions. That's true. Lions are obligate carnivores, we are not. What they didn't do was continue the comparison and say, okay, here's an obligate herbivore, like a horse, and we're not that either. I have a horse. My horse horses colic periodically. You know, they have very vulnerable GI tracts. My horse did some years ago. Wound up having surgery, and they extracted 15 feet of his intestine. And I was warned by lots of people in the horsey world that he would never recover fully. He did. They just need to be given the opportunity. He's perfect. But that's my point. He lost 15 feet of intestine, and neither of us can tell. That doesn't tend to happen with people. You lose 15 feet of your intestine, it makes a hell of a big difference. So we're not horses either. We're in the middle. We are clearly anatomically, physiologically omnivores, and I don't think anybody should be reluctant or ashamed. You know what that means? It means we've got choices. And then it's up to us to make good choices. And as we've been discussing extensively, the good reasons to choose plant-based diets include not just our own health, but kinder, gentler treatment of our fellow creatures and good stewardship of the planet. Make good choices.
Okay, Alex, I want to present the alternative view on that. There are profound differences between, of course, strict carnivores like lions and the type of herbivores that horses are and the type that humans are. But the remarkable thing is that if you look at the human GI tract and compare it to that of a horse, they look remarkably similar. And what's really interesting and really important is to understand that animals that are designed to subsist on a diet of other animals have to have a specific suite of anatomical adaptations that make that possible. Number one, hunting is inherently inefficient. Even the best designed predators on the planet will only make a kill in the wild on an average of 7 to 10 days. That means a study that was done in the Isle of National Royale National Park in Canada showed that one of the largest wolf packs were unsuccessful 95% of the time they went out to hunt. That meant that 95% of the time they tried to get a meal, they didn't get it. So the question is, what in God's name could allow an animal to miss 95% of its meals and still survive as a species? How
Joy, don't
can
move
these
existing
predators
ports, but
eat
money is
once
yours
every
to
7
build.
10 days and still not only live, but have enough energy to reproduce and raise their kids and then, make it till they can have another meal? Well, one of the biggest things is that they have giant stomachs. They have stomachs that allow them to eat 30% of their body weight at a single meal. That would mean that a person who weighs 150 pounds could eat 45 pounds of food at a single meal. Nobody can do that. The fact is that from elephants down through rabbits, all herbivores actually eat about 3.3% of their body weight every day. That actually includes humans. If you weigh the amount of food a human eats over the course of the day, it will come out to be roughly 3.3% of the body weight, depending on whether or not they're overeating and blowing up to the size of a Michelin man. So, but this is important because it has implications for not only our physiology, but also, and this is where we really dropped the ball, on the kind of research we should be doing in trying to understand human disease. We're told that we're omnivores. Everybody's been told that. That's a lie. Because the true omnivores in nature not only have physiological, anatomical adaptations to both procure and consume animal food and plant foods, they also have physiologic adaptations. So, for instance, you look at a bear. A bear can literally not eat for 6 months, come out of the den, find a rotting deer carcass, eat, 30% of its body weight of that deer carcass, and be perfectly fine. Do you know what happened to concentration camp victims when these camps were liberated by Allied soldiers and these starving people were given food? Many of them died because when they were given this massive concentrated load of very osmotically active food, it caused a massive shift of fluid from their already depleted bodies into their digestive tract. They got diarrhea, went into circulatory collapse, and died. That's why when you go into the hospital, if you have bowel surgery and you stop eating, the surgeons insist that you start to refeed yourself in a stepwise fashion. Because herbivores have a trophic digestive tract, meaning your gut cells only mature if they're constantly exposed to food. You stop eating, they stop maturing. If they stop maturing, they lose the ability to hold water and prevent water from translocating from your circulatory system into your digestive tract. They lose their ability to do that whole absorption thing that they do, and I'm kind of sort of shortening it, it's a little more complicated than that. But the differences between carnivores and herbivores actually even comes down to a subcellular level. And what I mean by that, there is a suite of enzymes in mammalian evolution that has been conserved throughout evolution. But where they're found within cells depends on the animal's diet. So in carnivores, these enzymes are found exclusively in the mitochondria, where they are used for gluconeogenesis. Well, why is that? Because carnivores don't eat a carbohydrate. So any carbohydrate they have, they've got to make. And their gluconeogenic enzymes are gluconeogenesis means making new glucose, are turned on 100% of the time, all day, every day. If you are a plant eater, you're eating plenty of starch and glucose, so you don't need to have full-time gluconeogenesis going on. But what you do need is you need the ability to detoxify plant alkaloids, because plants don't want to be eaten, and they load up their tissues with all of these compounds like caffeine and some other more sinister ones that when animals eat them can either make them sick or kill them. So if you are dependent on plants, you have to have the ability to detoxify these compounds. That's why you can't feed your pets like aspirin and other medicines or you can't give cats onions because it'll cause hemolytic anemia and things like that. They can't handle those compounds. And so in strict herbivores, these enzyme systems are found exclusively in cellular organelles called lysosomes. In by-design omnivores like bears and raccoons that are designed to eat both plant and animal foods, you find, okay, I get it, half in the mitochondria, half in the lysosomes. Where are they found in humans? Exclusively in the lysosomes, as they are in all strict herbivores.
Mic drop. All right, I guess I'll take the protein question. since that's been kind of my area of interest. So how much protein do we need? Well, the RDA did a series of studies and reviews of these over many, many years, which I...
Sometimes there is a tendency to tell just part of a full story because that part better makes your point. So, any of you see it? Game Changers? So, there's the segment in the middle where we're talking about anatomy, and they compare the human anatomy to a lion, and the lion's GI tract is shorter, and all of that. And, okay, we're not lions. That's true. Lions are obligate carnivores, we are not. What they didn't do was continue the comparison and say, okay, here's an obligate herbivore, like a horse, and we're not that either. I have a horse. My horse, actually, horses colic periodically. They have very vulnerable GI tracts. My horse did some years ago. Wound up having surgery, and they extracted 15 feet of his intestine. And I was warned by lots of people in the horsey world that he would never recover fully. He did. He just needs to be given the opportunity. He's perfect. But that's my point. He lost 15 feet of intestine, and neither of us can tell. That doesn't tend to happen with people. You lose 15 feet of your intestine, it makes a hell of a big difference. So we're not horses either. We're in the middle. We are clearly anatomically, physiologically omnivores, and I don't think anybody should be reluctant or ashamed. You know what that means? It means we've got choices. And then it's up to us to make good choices. And as we've been discussing extensively, the good reasons to choose plant-based diets include not just our own health, but kinder, gentler treatment of our fellow creatures and good stewardship of the planet. Make good choices.
Okay, Alex, I want to present the alternative view on that. There are profound differences between, of course, strict carnivores like lions and the type of herbivores that horses are and the type that humans are. But the remarkable thing is that if you look at the human GI tract and compare it to that of a horse, they look remarkably similar. And what's really interesting and really important is to understand that animals that are designed to subsist on a diet of other animals have to have a specific suite of anatomical adaptations that make them possible. Number one, hunting is inherently inefficient. Even the best designed predators on the planet will only make a kill in the wild on an average of 7 to 10 days. That means a study that was done in the Isle of National Royale National Park in Canada showed that one of the largest wolf packs were unsuccessful 95% of the time they went out to hunt. That meant that 95% of the time they tried to get a meal, they didn't get it. So the question is, what in God's name could allow an animal to miss 95% of its meals and still survive as a species? How can these predators eat once every 7 to 10 days and still not only live, but have enough energy to reproduce and raise their kids and then, make it till they can have another meal? Well, one of the biggest things is that they have giant stomachs. They have stomachs that allow them to eat 30% of their body weight at a single meal. That would mean that a person who weighs 150 pounds could eat 45 pounds of food at a single meal. Nobody can do that. The fact is that from elephants down through rabbits, all herbivores actually eat about 3.3% of their body weight every day. That actually includes humans. If you weigh the amount of food a human eats over the course of the day, it will come out to be roughly 3.3% of the body weight, depending on whether or not they're overeating and blowing up to the size of a Michelin man. So, but this is important because it has implications for not only our physiology, but also, and this is where we really dropped the ball, on the kind of research we should be doing in trying to understand human disease. We're told that we're omnivores. Everybody's been told that. That's a lie. Because the true omnivores in nature not only have physiological, anatomical adaptations to both procure and consume animal food and plant foods, they also have physiologic adaptations. So, for instance, you look at a bear. A bear can literally not eat for 6 months, come out of the den, find a rotting deer carcass, eat, 30% of its body weight of that deer carcass, and be perfectly fine. Do you know what happened to concentration camp victims when these camps were liberated by Allied soldiers and these starving people were given food? Many of them died because when they were given this massive concentrated load of very osmotically active food, it caused a massive shift of fluid from their already depleted bodies into their digestive tract. They got diarrhea, went into circulatory collapse, and died. That's why when you go into the hospital, if you have bowel surgery and you stop eating, the surgeons insist that you start to refeed yourself in a stepwise fashion, because herbivores have a trophic digestive tract, meaning your gut cells only mature if they're constantly exposed to food. You stop eating, they stop maturing. If they stop maturing, they lose the ability to hold water and prevent water from translocating from your circulatory system into your digestive tract. They lose their ability to do that whole absorptive thing that they do, and I'm kind of sort of shortening it. It's a little more complicated than that. But the differences between carnivores and herbivores actually even comes down to a subcellular level. And what I mean by that, there is a suite of enzymes in mammalian evolution that has been conserved throughout evolution. But where they're found within cells depends on the animal's diet. So in carnivores, these enzymes are found exclusively in the mitochondria, where they are used for gluconeogenesis. Well, why is that? Because carnivores don't eat a carbohydrate. So any carbohydrate they have, they've got to make. And their gluconeogenic enzymes are turned, gluconeogenesis meaning making new glucose, are turned on 100% of the time, all day, every day. If you are a plant eater, you're eating plenty of starch and glucose, so you don't need to have full-time gluconeogenesis going on. But what you do need is you need the ability to detoxify plant alkaloids, because plants don't want to be eaten, and they load up their tissues with all of these compounds like caffeine and some other more sinister ones that when animals eat them can either make them sick or kill them. So if you are dependent on plants, you have to have the ability to detoxify these compounds. That's why you can't feed your pets like aspirin and other medicines or you can't give cats onions because it'll cause hemolytic anemia and things like that. They can't handle those compounds. And so in strict herbivores, these enzyme systems are found exclusively in cellular organelles called lysosomes. In by design omnivores like bears and raccoons that are designed to eat both plant and animal foods, you find, okay, I get it, half in the mitochondria, half in the lysosomes. Where are they found in humans? Exclusively in the lysosomes, as they are in all strict herbivores.
Mic drop.
Demo need Elvita 4.
Question, since that's been kind of my area of interest. So how much protein do we need? Well, the RDA did a series of studies and reviews of these over many, many years, which I catalog in my book. They came up using nitrogen utilization studies, so you measure how much nitrogen you take in, how much nitrogen you put out, to kind of come up with an idea of how much nitrogen we need. And then you build a normal curve. You know what a normal curve is, right? So some people needed a certain amount, other people's needed a certain amount. They wanted to make sure that people got, before they give a recommended daily allowance, they want to make sure that enough people got all the protein that they needed in order to get proper utilization and not get what's called catabolic, where you're breaking down protein. And so they recommended roughly 56 grams for an adult male, 46 for a female. Now you got to remember, that's 2 standard deviations above the normal, because they want to make sure they got everybody, over 90% of the population. So probably we need less than those recommendations, but to be safe, those are the those are not the minimum you need. That's the be safe, we got you covered. 56 grams for a male, 46 grams for a female. MIT kind of came out with a study saying that wasn't an effective way of looking at this, and they looked at something called muscle protein stimulation studies using radioactive labeled amino acids and that utilization, and that brought the number up a bit, though they never provided much studies showing that we were deficient at those levels. In fact, people eat way more than that 56 grams for a male and 46 grams for a female. Depending on whether you look at the NHANES data or what you're looking at, it's 70 to 100, sometimes 120. Bodybuilders are going for 180 over that 56 grams. And the muscle protein studies are basically get us that formula usually here, which is 0.8 grams per kilogram lean body mass, not your weight, but what your lean fat-free mass is. People now say 0.8 per pound or 0.8 per total weight, which is inaccurate. So people are way overeating both the RDA's recommendations and even the further studies. If you're exercising, yes, you need more. How much? Oh my God, there's about 10 million studies on this and a lot of argument. In the exercise physiology world, they're saying between 1.8 and 2.2 seems to be the same. There's no difference. There's some studies saying 1.6 grams per kilogram lean body mass. There's a lot at 1.2. I will tell you, if you're an Olympic athlete and you're trying to get that 0.5 seconds in order to get the gold, maybe you need slightly more. But when you look at the studies showing the increased protein, and not look at muscle protein synthesis, but rather look at actual muscle size or actual weight lifted, it makes such a minuscule difference that I don't know why you would take on the risk of higher protein for that tiny little minuscule difference. So typically, I go with, if you're an athlete, 1.2 grams per kilogram lean body mass, not your weight. If you're a regular person going about your day, walking normally, I like the RDA. And I think it works well. As far as can you get enough on a plant-based protein, is that enough? Obviously it's enough. There's very good studies on long-term vegans, as we've talked about, showing that they actually live longer. And unless you're getting, the only studies I've seen with protein deficiency have all been Kenyan studies and things like that, where you're living with people with subsistence, eating nothing but cereal, barely getting their protein, and if they do, they're getting it basically with low calories too. In my practice, and I don't know if anybody's seen anybody suffering from low protein that wasn't low calories. Has anybody ever seen that before? I just haven't seen it, so.
I like to give freedom.
Oh, and as far as children are concerned, they can certainly do it too. The only thing I caution with children is you got to make sure the children are eating a varied diet. Protein is very important. You do need protein. It's so important. It happens to be in just about everything we eat. So you can get it with plants, but you got to make sure that they are getting the more plant concentrated proteins such as legumes. So if you got a kid who doesn't want to eat legumes at all, doesn't want to eat any nuts at all, well, you got a little bit of an issue where you do need to make sure they're getting enough protein. What's that? Yeah, you can't do that. Yeah. You're not going to bed until you eat your lentils.
I'll just continue on the protein conversation because I completely agree with everything you said, but I would simply add that I have seen a couple of instances where people aren't getting quite enough protein. And so one is in teenagers who often become very passionate about animal rights and the environment, which is a wonderful thing. But they kind of do a switch from eating burgers and fries and Coke to just eating the fries and Coke. And so they're eating an awful lot of sugar and an awful lot of fat. And on some occasions, I've seen some getting 20 to 30 grams of protein a day. And for a growing teenager, that's not enough. So they need to add in more concentrated protein sources such as legumes and tofu and things like that, nuts and seeds and so forth. The second group, of course, we know about people not getting enough calories and people with eating disorders. But the other group that may not get enough protein are people that are eating pretty much exclusively fruit. And some fruits have very low protein concentration. So on average, people probably need, around 10% of calories from protein, depending on the person, but many fruits are much lower than that, so it's possible in that situation. And I've seen it on a number of occasions, people doing a raw diet where it's mainly fruits, some vegetables, and a lot of oils. And in that case, they need to add more nuts and seeds. They may need to add some sprouted lentils and things like that.
Brenda, what was their phenotypic presentation? I mean, how are you diagnosing them with protein deficiency?
So what we often see in the raw food folks, I mean, in children, sometimes you just see them not thriving as they should. But in the other folks, we see hair loss. And this is really quite common in the raw world where people really start losing a lot of hair. Their nails aren't growing well, or they have problems with them. They have problems, skin problems. Their skin almost looks thin and weak. And so we have to remember that protein is, and we see bone loss. And I know that is a bit of a controversial subject, but of course protein is necessary for building the matrix of bones. And so you can be too low. And in fact, there was an Adventist health study, looking at 65,000 women that found that those eating a few legumes had a much higher rate of wrist fracture than those eating more legumes and getting more protein in their diet. So there is a sort of a level at which you don't want to go too much below. And so I've working with raw food people, I have seen that when we add a little protein to the diet, they tend to overcome some of these issues.
I wanted, Joel, before you take on another question, two references to add to this protein discussion and one anecdote. One of the references is by Christopher Gardner at Stanford University. Really nice report, Advances in Nutrition, about a year ago, making perfectly clear that all plants contain all of the essential amino acids. That's just sort of been a myth in nutrition for a very long time. We followed that up working together with others and wrote a paper arguing for a modernization of the definition of protein quality, because we talk about the quality of protein independently of the quality of the food, and that misleads. And so the idea that meat is high quality protein, if you look at the concentration of amino acids, but if the meat is going to make you more prone to death and disease and not do any favors, the food is not high quality. And if you can get all those same proteins, the levels you need from plants that are actually good for you and good for the planet and all of that, that's a higher quality source of protein. The anecdote, just very quickly, is last night, before my panel, I went to get something to eat in the lobby, and they had a quinoa salad at this little atrium restaurant out here. I said, okay, well, that looks okay. And the server asked me, would you like protein with that? I said, actually,
that is my least favorite question.
Yeah, quinoa is a pretty good source of protein, actually. And she said, really?
Yeah.
So the quinoa was the source of protein.
Gardner was pretty interesting at ACLM. He went through his diet and he actually went and looked at did he have any, because he was eating a plant-based diet, did he have any amino acid deficiencies, and he couldn't find that he had a single amino acid deficiency. But the meat-based industry is starting to jump on this terminology of protein quality, assuming that having higher leucine is therefore good for you. But we know that higher leucine increases IGF-1 and stimulates mTOR, which leads to possible cancer and aging. And so having more of a certain amino acid is not necessarily better.
David, do you want cholesterol drugs or do you want dementia? You can take your topic, I don't care.
No, I don't. I took anatomy.
Okay, you took
I was like horses, lions. No.
Well, I'll take dementia because I'm speaking about cholesterol drugs tomorrow.
But do I want cholesterol drugs or dementia? No. But thank you for asking.
I wanted you to read into it what you wanted to read into it. Can you prevent dementia was basically the question. Yeah, and I'm not a neurologist, but one has to be familiar, well-read, and we are all concerned about our memory and where we left our car in the parking lot. There was a splash about 3-4 years ago, a scientist out of the Buck Institute in San Francisco, and then a book called The End of Alzheimer's that was embraced very quickly by the functional medicine community, of which I'm a member, but I don't agree eye to eye with all. The idea that there are 36 holes in the roof of your house if you're starting to lose your memory, that's the analogy. And you can plug each and every one of them, some with fitness, some with diet that favors a ketogenic diet in this approach, and a whole lot of supplements from huperzine to vinpocetine and on and on. It quickly became a franchise, and the author of the book profited quite nicely. He did publish a scientific paper, but it's not Alzheimer's. It's at best something called MCI, mild cognitive impairment, that may progress on, but may not progress on to the clinical diagnosis of Alzheimer's. 9 of 10 patients showed some improvement. And then there was a business, and there hasn't been much follow-up publication. A number of my friends in the Detroit community did train in this kind of franchise of brain health. They basically have all abandoned it. It was very expensive for patients. It was very complex. And there really hasn't been a good foundation to show that it actually prevented Alzheimer's. On the other hand, within a few months out came the Gears5 Alzheimer's solution. You may know that book. I think it's a wonderful book with the neuro program of nutrition and exercise and optimized mind-body and other features there, some mind games. But they certainly do not claim that they prevent dementia. In fact, most reasonable scientists don't believe at this point. We actually know that anybody can prevent it. There is an inherited risk called ApoE. I have a practice full of people who've inherited a rather adverse ApoE44 that 20 years earlier in life than on average, you may start to have some memory issues, and there seems to be an advantage to a low saturated fat diet, which is perhaps our community, and lower alcohol consumption. But these are trends. We don't really know that all for sure. You know, the general trend is that a lot of cognitive impairment is cardiovascular impairment, it's microcirculation, it's vascular dementia. And certainly this theme out of the Chicago Healthy Aging Project and other is that optimal blood pressure, optimal blood sugar, optimal blood cholesterol, regular fitness, good sleep, avoidance of smoking. And I would say embracing a whole food diet, largely of plants, would be wise. But I think there's science to come before we say we, have certainly beat down Alzheimer's. I don't think anybody really claims that yet. I'll say, just tying in the question we didn't do, the general data is statins don't cause Alzheimer's. If anything, they're neutral and may have a slight advantage if your cholesterol is 300 and there's no other mechanism to bring it down. The latest meta-analysis are fairly, reassuring.
Okay, I'm going to ask 6 more questions. In this case, yes.
Joel, how much glucose dysregulation have you seen with statins? Because I've seen a fair amount in clinic.
Yeah. So there's, good question, and there is no direct understanding why there's been an observation. It may be a mitochondrial toxin is the common statement, whether simvastatin is the most glycemic of statins, it used to be called Zocor, and some of the others are more favorable, as mentioned, whether coenzyme Q10, at least in one lab study, protected the mitochondria, and this response has been mentioned, but there's very little data on it, actually. I mean, there's the databases that suggest if you're a healthy person and you're placed on a statin, the likelihood you're going to see a major shift in your insulin sensitivity and actually develop diabetes is very low. But if your hemoglobin A1C is 6.2 and your waistline is 43 inches and your diet is not optimal, it may push you a couple points up on measures and you will fulfill criteria of type 2 diabetes. Offset by what I'll talk about tomorrow, at least some data to suggest it prevents the #1 killer of men and women in high-risk subsets like previous heart attacks and post-bypass and such. In my own clinic, I'm concerned. I'm not a aggressive statin user, but they need to be pulled out now and then. And I have stopped people's statins, and you always can for a couple months repeat the hemoglobin A1C. It wanders down. I won't say it's amazingly potent intervention to stop and reassess, but I will, and very often 3-4 times a week reintroduce it, and you get pretty adequate balance between cardiovascular risk reduction and not elevating the blood sugar. I think it's a real deal, though.
Okay, so I have more questions, and I guess for time's sake, if we could keep them to 2 minutes, that would be ideal. Okay, so the first question is, do plant-based eaters or vegans have to be especially careful to get enough vitamin D, DHA, EPA, iodine, taurine, vanadium, chromium, and omega-3s? Is there any risk in getting all of these from supplements as opposed to food? That's question 1. Question 2 is, Dr. Khan, you said I've been inside the heart 15,000 times and I've never scooped sugar out of a blocked artery. I scoop cholesterol out of blocked arteries. Please explain this. Question 3. What does the science say about fish consumption and health? Does fish raise our TMAO levels, and why does this matter? Does fish have mercury in it, and why does this matter? Question 4. Are there any whole food plant-based foods we should avoid, such as potatoes, certain high oxalate green vegetables, nightshade vegetables, peanuts, cashews, which supposedly are not really raw because they have to be heated because that's how they get them. Brian Clement from Hippocrates says black beans are very hybridized and very hard to digest. People have been saying brown rice is grown in areas where there's high arsenic. So are there any whole food plant-based diets that are not on your list to say go ahead with? Question 5, how do you prevent and treat urinary tract infections? And question 6, it was said 21 international organizations, including the World Health Organization, American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology, Institute of Medicine, all say eat as little saturated fat as possible. They couldn't be more clear, and these are highbrow organizations not associated with the vegan movement. 21 out of 21 groups say the same thing. Please explain this a little more. So one more time. First question was on the supplements, second was Dr. Khan, third was on fish and TNAO, fourth was on whole food plant-based foods that we might want to avoid, fifth was urinary tract infections, and the sixth was the 21 out of 21 groups.
I'll go first, and I want to talk about the foods to avoid. The first thing is this issue of hybridization comes up a lot. And if you were to go to the grocery store and say, I would like for you to point me in the direction of the area of the produce section where the non-hybridized foods are, there are none. And this is a good thing for the most part. In fact, the reason why there was a potato famine that killed 1 million people in Ireland was because there was only one kind of potato that was grown here. And had they been hybridizing potatoes, and there were lots of varieties of potatoes, people would have just eaten the potatoes that weren't hit by the blight, all right? And so hybridization has been going on since the beginning of agriculture, and breeding plants together, like tomatoes with tomatoes and soybeans with soybeans, to come up with bigger tomatoes. Like my father, after he retired, got involved with the OSU horticulture department, got a master's degree in horticulture. And they were breeding something that ended up being the mortgage lifter tomato. This guy invented it because he lost his job and he helped pay off his mortgage with these tomatoes. But anyway, they were designed to be like the size of a slice of bread, so that you'd have one slice of tomato that really held its form. And there's, it was cool. There's nothing the matter with it. It tasted really great. So the first thing is, discarding the food because it's hybridized, you've got nothing left to eat. We need to hope that there are new hybridized foods coming out all the time that can meet the needs of the population around the world. The problem is people confuse this with genetic modification, and they're not the same thing. All right, that's not the same thing. I think the biggest, without going into all these individual foods, because Steve wants to keep us to 2 minutes, and we're doing such a good job following your directions. Have you noticed that? But the problem with the foods to avoid list is that this goes back to this one-size-fits-all. I mean, people write books about gluten is bad. Well, you know what? If you have celiac disease, it's really bad, all right? And if you have certain types of autoimmune disease, it's probably good to stay away at least from high-gluten foods. But not the rest of the world. If you go into anaphylactic shock when you're exposed to peanuts, you should not eat them. Well, you know what? To keep us to 2 minutes, and we're doing such a good job following your directions. Have you noticed that? But the problem with the foods to avoid list is that this goes back to this one size fits all. I mean, people write books about gluten is bad. Well, you know what? If you have celiac disease, it's really bad, all right? And if you have certain types of autoimmune disease, it's probably good to stay away at least from high-gluten foods. But not the rest of the world. If you go into anaphylactic shock when you're exposed to peanuts, you should not eat them. But I don't, and so there's no reason for me to not have peanuts as well. So I think it's very important that we not try to come up with hit lists of foods that we're not supposed to eat, because most people can eat most of them without any problem at all. So first of all, if you have a food allergy, I mean, if you eat strawberries and your tongue swells up and you can't swallow, do not eat them, all right? But that's not an indictment of strawberries, and everybody should stay away from it. So in the interest of time, I won't say more, but there's lots more to the topic.
Okay. I'll take fish for 400. When patients or conference attendees ask me the question, well, what about fish? If I'm feeling flippant, I'll say, well, what about them? But the question I typically ask them, I said, let's say you were someone or an animal that had to eat lungs. That's all you could eat. Would you eat the lungs of an animal raised in the cold? And everybody scratches up their face, of course not. Because it'd be filthy. They'd be full of coal dust and tar and God knows what else. Well, the oceans are filthy. They are loaded. We dump sewage and all sorts of industrial waste and toxins in them. And fish have to filter that to breathe. So fish tissue is actually some of the animal tissue that has the highest loads of toxins of anything someone can put in their body. So that is a problem. And it's not just the mercury. It's also PCBs, it's pesticide residues, I mean, you name it, on and on down the line. But also because of all of the fertilizers we are dumping into the oceans, we are creating these algae blooms where these toxic algae blooms release these toxins into the water that are also taken up by fish. And studies have shown that people from certain areas who eat a lot of fish are at higher risk for developing what is colloquially known as Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS. It's what Stephen Hawking had. It's generally a relentlessly debilitating and ultimately fatal neurologic disease. And there's also some suggestion from certain studies that these algal toxins are also related to Parkinson's and possibly dementia risk. But the bottom line is fish flesh is animal flesh. And as Garth has pointed out, as we've talked already, higher intakes of animal tissue correlate with increased mortality, a higher risk for cancer because it turns on cancer genes. Not to mention the fact that you have all of the cancer-causing compounds that come from cooking the fish, and then, of course, it does increase TMO, which is another toxin. And so the bottom line is let the fish swim and be happy and eat your plants.
I don't feel strongly about it. How do I treat UTIs with antibiotics? Yep, thank you.
There actually was a report in the last 2 weeks, again, of lower UTI rates in vegetarians. I didn't read the study in detail. And some of this handling of chicken in the kitchen, the same.
E. coli,
straight. Exactly. So,
but I guess
and there is
just
some
build some
value from
cranberry juice. There's the treated infection. Again, I think I mentioned this a bit on my talk today. Food is medicine, but it is not the only medicine, and there will be times that we need lipitor, times that we need antibiotics. And I have seen some very, very sick people who refused to use medicines until it was almost too late. So don't get into that idea that Western medicine is absolutely terrible. It's not. It's good at sick care. It's not good at health care, but it's good at sick care.
I made the same point earlier. We have the opportunity to rely on diet and lifestyle as primary medicine. Everyone can benefit, and then a lot fewer of us will need a lot fewer medications. But when we happen to need one, it's a good thing that we have them. Rates of stroke have declined primarily because of effective treatment of hypertension, which is genetic. Sometimes some people eat optimally, they're still hypertensive. Effective drugs that they tolerate well may be the difference between having a stroke and not. So, yeah, I completely agree there. There are only a couple of questions left. I guess one of the remaining ones was that 21 and 21 august organizations cite a link between higher intake of saturated fat and higher rates of heart disease and other bad stuff. Yeah, that's because it's true. That's it.
No, I wanted to say something about the UTIs. In response
Yeah,
to
no, so, being a little bit good, but, for example, last night on the panel, Colin, I think argued against saturated fat, placing the emphasis on animal protein. I'm a pragmatist, so, yes, I do believe the evidence regarding the mechanistic adverse effects of saturated fat. I also believe the mechanistic adverse effects of animal protein, but we eat foods. And the simple fact is that we get our excess of animal protein and our excess of saturated fat from all the same sources. I think one of the ways to sidestep a lot of unnecessary controversy, generate a lot more light and quite a bit less heat, is to talk about foods, which I think is the native predisposition of this group anyway when we say whole food, plant-based. We're talking about whole foods. Okay, then what are the foods? Diets made up predominantly or exclusively of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds, and water when you're thirsty. And then, frankly, you're avoiding the animal protein, you're avoiding the saturated fat, you fix a host of ills. Fixate on any one nutrient, there are still ways to get the foods wrong. And, let's be clear, you could be strictly vegan on a diet of Coca-Cola and cotton candy. That wouldn't make it a good idea, right? So saturated fat's not the only thing wrong. Get the foods right, the nutrients tend to sort themselves out.
I just wanted to add something about the UTIs, and that is that I agree, the UTI, you give the antibiotic, but we get people in our office who have 6 UTIs a year, and they take antibiotics again and again, and nobody ever stops to say, why do you keep getting these UTIs? And so, and plus, you do this for 3 or 4 years, and antibiotic-resistant bacterial infections are life-threatening, and we have to be more conscious of that, I think, in medicine. So you can deal with UTIs a little bit differently, and you have to. By the time somebody's had 24 rounds of antibiotics, that's not fixing anything. In fact, the next one comes more often. So we look at hydration. We look at using plant antimicrobials and with very high dose probiotics to restore, to address the infection without more antibiotics, and also to restore the immune system, which has been completely wiped out, or the microbiome, which has been completely wiped out, and adds increased susceptibility. And then using cranberry juice not from concentrate, mixed in with raw honey, because raw honey has antibacterial properties, and there are studies in medical journals about this. So drinking cranberry juice, you have to sweeten it with something anyway, or your lips will wrap around the bottle, so sour. So if you do these things, it takes some time, but we have people who've had 5 to 6 UTIs a year for 5 and 6 years and wiped it out, and we never have another one again. And so I think one time antibiotic, don't worry about it, but if it's repetitive, you have to say something's going on here, and before we really do some damage with the antibiotics, we should look at why and fix that.
Just a quick thing on the saturated fat, because it comes up a lot, and you will hear about the study, which was called the Siri-Torino study, which was the study that really started all the saturated fat doesn't cause heart disease. It was sponsored by industry, as you might imagine, but they did a kind of a simple trick. They took a bunch of different, it was a meta-analysis, they looked at a bunch of different studies. You got to understand these studies, they're trying to show a relation between saturated fat, or lack of relation between saturated fat and heart disease. They controlled for independent risk factors of heart disease, one of those being cholesterol. So you understand the problem here. If you control for cholesterol, one of the methods that saturated fat causes heart disease is by raising cholesterol. So again, if I take this big group of people and I say everybody in you that are out here that have high cholesterol leave the room, I've kind of eliminated all the people that are being affected by saturated fat. And so therefore, I'm kind of making the game play in my favor, which is what they did with that study and how we started with this whole wait, saturated fat isn't bad for you.
You guys are all doing good.
Well, I know we have 2 minutes per question, and the question that I'm taking is not a 2-minute question, so I might just pick a little fraction of the question, and that was the one about specific nutrients like vitamin D and DHA, and what other ones were there in that?
Vitamin D, DHA, EPA, iodine, taurine, vanadium, chromium, and omega-3s.
Yeah. So we'll do omega-3s and vitamin D, maybe iodine. I'll tackle 3 as quickly as I can.
I know, sweaty.
I'll start with iodine because that's a really quick one. What we know is that this is a very critical nutrient, a lack of which is certainly the leading cause of mental retardation in children in the world. So that's something we need to take care of. The key sources in the diet are generally fish and seafood and dairy products because we use iodine to clean the teats of the cows. And so, I mean, we iodize salt to help prevent these kinds of deficiency in the population, and a lot of vegans don't like to use iodized salt. And so we do, especially in Europe, see much higher rates of iodine insufficiency in those populations. So what we need to do is figure out a reasonable source of iodine for people, and that would be, I mean, certainly people who are willing to use iodized salt or just iodine supplement, or certainly seaweed, because seaweed is loaded with iodine. Now, so loaded that you can easily reach the upper limit of 1,100 micrograms of iodine eating a lot of seaweed. And one of the foods that I would avoid in the plant-based world is hijiki, because of the hijiki is a very, very high in heavy metals, and so many countries avoid against its use for that reason. So anyway, if you're using seaweed as your primary source of iodine, it's maybe 1/10 of a teaspoon of kelp. Kelp is super concentrated in iodine, and if you're using nori, it's about 1.5 sheets of nori for 150 micrograms. You can use, I think it's about 1 gram of wakame or arami. So those are all reasonable options for iodine. And vitamin D, well, of iodine insufficiency in those populations. So what we need to do is figure out a reasonable source of iodine for people, and that would be I mean, certainly people who are willing to use iodized salt or just iodine supplement, or certainly seaweed, because seaweed is loaded with iodine. Now, so loaded that you can easily reach the upper limit of 1,100 micrograms of iodine eating a lot of seaweed. And one of the foods that I would avoid in the plant-based world is hijiki, because of the hijiki is very, very high in heavy metals, and so many countries avoid against its use for that reason. So anyway, if you're using seaweed as your primary source of iodine, it's maybe 1/10 of a teaspoon of kelp. Kelp is super concentrated in iodine. And if you're using nori, it's about 1.5 sheets of nori for 150 micrograms. You can use, I think it's about 1 gram of wakame or arami. So those are all reasonable options for iodine. And vitamin D, well, certainly the sun is the very best source of vitamin D. Unfortunately, There are a lot of people that live in very cool climates that are not exposed to any warm sunshine for several months of the year. And some are rich enough to go to Hawaii or other lovely spots to get sunshine, but not everyone is. And for those people, I think that it's a reasonable thing to supplement with vitamin D. Now, vitamin D for the omnivorous population, the main sources are fish and eggs and of course milk that's been fortified with vitamin D. We are fortifying some of the non-dairy milks with vitamin D, but still not people probably don't consume enough of those to meet their needs. So it is reasonable to have a vitamin D supplement in that case. And then the DHA, EPA, omega-3 fatty acids is a huge debate within the plant-based world right now. As many people know, there's a segment of the leadership of the sort of plant-based movement who are saying that we probably should not be taking direct sources of EPA and DHA. So here's what we know. We know that vegans have low levels of EPA and DHA. We know that EPA and DHA are very biologically active, essential, long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. Technically, they're not considered essential. They may be conditionally essential if you can't convert alpha-linolenic acid. There's a series of elongations and desaturations that allow us to produce EPA and DHA. In young women, that conversion can be quite efficient. Where there was a study in the UK showing about 36% of ALA was converted to either EPA, DPA, or DHA. And it was about 21% to EPA and about 9% to DHA, which is really quite remarkable. But if you think about it, a young woman has to be prepared to grow a baby and a brain. And so I can imagine that they would have reasonable conversion ability. In young men, it was a 16% conversion, about, I think, 8% to EPA, 8% to DPA, and nothing to DHA. And so, you know, to be honest, we don't know what ideal really is. We don't know if vegans absolutely need to be taking preformed. There are very few sources of preformed long-chain omega-3 fatty acids in the plant kingdom. Seaweed has a little bit of EPA, no DHA. But what a lot of people don't know is that EPA and DHA are not made by fish. They are made by microalgae. And these are tiny plants in the ocean, and that's where fish get them at some point along the food chain. And so many people are now culturing these microalgae to be able to provide people who don't eat fish with a direct source of EPA and DHA. Do we need it? We don't know. However, what we do know is that some people have increased needs, pregnant and lactating women, so it may be an advantage to get a little bit more. And we also know that some people have a reduced reduction of the desaturase enzymes responsible for the conversion. So, for example, people with diabetes and hypertension, people who come from regions where for generations fish was a major staple within their diets, they may not produce as much. And so for those individuals, it may make sense to boost intakes a little bit with a direct source of EPA and DHA. So there's still controversy, there's still a lot we don't know. In my opinion, I don't think it's an unreasonable thing to take a small amount a couple of times a week that would sort of approximate what fish eaters would get eating fish a couple of times a week. And certainly we do need to make sure we're getting enough alpha-linolenic acid, and this is the plant omega-3 that we find mainly in chia seeds and flax seeds and hemp seeds and walnuts. Also, about half of half the fat in leafy greens is omega-3, but the fat in greens is so dilute, it's not a very rich source of fat. So you would have to eat like a horse or a cow to get enough. You would want to be eating about 20 to 40 cups of leafy greens a day to get 2 to 4 grams of omega-3s. So we need to supplement that with some more concentrated sources of omega-3s. And I think I'll just leave it at that.
Brenda, I want to append something quickly. I think I mentioned last night I agree with my friend Walter Willett about almost everything. We do have at least one small disagreement. Walter mentioned last night, for those of you who were here, that we shouldn't worry at all about omega-6 fatty acids, and no matter how much we get, it doesn't matter. It's actually strong research in the lipidology literature. Tom Brenna, in particular, who is at Cornell, now at UT Austin, done studies showing that a very high intake of omega-6 interferes with that pathway you just described. So the conversion of ALA to DHA in particular is actually effectively blocked by a very high intake of omega-6. So where are you going to get a very high intake of omega-6? Expressed oils used in processed foods. So lots of corn oil, lots of soybean oil, safflower, sunflower. So in general, these may be okay. But if they make up a big part of your diet, they effectively block the pathway, make it more likely that your DHA levels are going to be very low.
Yes, and in defense of Walter Willett, I think what we've found more recently in the literature is that whereas we used to think omega-6 was very pro-inflammatory, that we're seeing that it's not so pro-inflammatory. However, we do need to put a lid on omega-6 because it can, see that it's the same enzymes that convert the omega-6s and the omega-3s. And if we get a lot of omega-6s, it can preferentially convert the omega-6s, and you get a reduction of conversion of omega-3s of up to 40 to 60% when you eat a lot of omega-6s. Omega-6s, you're talking safflower oil, sunflower oil, corn oil, grapeseed oil. So you're not wanting to be consuming
traditionally soy. So if you're mostly eating whole foods and getting your fats from there, or if the oil you use preferentially is extra virgin olive oil, you avoid this problem anyway. So the whole food approach is effectively a solution to the omega-3 excess. Yeah, so what Walter focused on was inflammatory effects. But the fact is, an imbalance and an excess of omega-6 may have some adverse metabolic
Yes,
effects.
particularly for people who are not consuming direct sources of EPA and DHA like vegans. So it's much less of an issue for omnivores who are consuming direct sources if they're eating fish. There are other dietary factors that can slow conversion as well. Trans fatty acids, saturated fats, a lack of specific nutrients, certain vitamins and minerals and protein, alcohol. So we need to be consuming a well-balanced diet to maximize conversion. We know aging can reduce conversion. So as we get older, we convert less efficiently. Gender, there are lots of factors that can affect conversion ability. So, yeah, thank you for
One thing I want to add about this, I appreciate your saying, Brenda, about we are not clear on this, about this omega-3 situation and EPA and DHA. And I think this is an important clarification because we have some people in our movement who are basically making claims that the lower levels of DHA, for example, in vegans, is a dangerous thing. It's already been decided. This is going to lead to disaster. We're all going to be demented or something like that. And this is a ridiculous statement to make. We simply don't know. And I think that when we don't know, we should say we don't know. Because when we go out there with a great deal of bravado and make a claim about something that's patently false, what you're hoping is that there's not a smart person in the room who knows that it's patently false. And I don't think you can build a business or promote a movement that is dependent on not smart people listening to your message. So I appreciate that clarification. The other thing is you mentioned about diabetics, for example, having lower levels. And what we see is people who are sick have lower levels of a lot of things. There's a good deal of evidence that lower vitamin D levels are more a function of people being in poor health than anything else. There's one very good study that illustrates the point, lots of them, but this one's really crystal clear. People arriving at an emergency room in Georgia, hyperglycemic enough that they had to go to the hospital. Their vitamin D levels were 12.3 when they got there, and as soon as their glucose levels stabilized, they went up to 27.3, all right? So you can see the foolishness of doing intervention with vitamin D for diabetics, thinking it's somehow going to make them better because diabetics have low levels of vitamin D. So I think when we look at which comes first, is it the low vitamin D that's contributing to the disease, or the disease that has caused the low D, or the low DHA, whatever? We have to be careful that we're actually looking at what is causing what before we go out the deep end and say, oh my gosh, you're eating a vegan diet, you have to take these supplements, or you're pre-diabetic, so if you take these supplements, it's going to somehow help you. So I think that clarification needs to be made.
Do you guys, when I look at vitamin D to try to decide whether or not someone needs vitamin D, one of the primary roles of vitamin D is to allow calcium absorption in the intestine. So I look at parathyroid hormone. Do you guys look at parathyroid hormone to see whether or not their vitamin D is actually affecting their calcium? Does anybody else do that? Am I the only one who checks parathyroid?
Only if they're hypercalcemic.
Check. But I mean, if they're normal calcemic, but they've got a high parathyroid hormone, that means their body, because you can be normal calcemic and still be low in calcium. And so then I say, okay, well, your vitamin D supplement in that situation. I don't.
2 minutes on sugar and heart disease. I had an opportunity to make the statement that was quoted on the Joe Rogan Experience September 2018 that I've been in heart arteries as an interventional cardiologist 15,000 times, and I've never scooped out sugar because you can actually do a procedure and scoop out plaque. 1913 was the first year Anichkow identified that in atherosclerosis there is cholesterol. Then we fed mice high cholesterol diets, they developed plaque. That led in many other data points and I think 11 Nobel Prizes to what's been called the cholesterol hypothesis, that serum cholesterol has a relationship to the development of the #1 killer men and women. Very seminal in this data was Ansel Keys. You've heard his name a couple times. Dr. Willett showed a slide from the 7-country study. I'll show another one tomorrow at lunchtime. And that was the leading hypothesis. And if you think the food wars are ugly now at times, in the 1960s came an Englishman named John Yudkin who had the contrary view. It's sugar, it's not cholesterol. Dr. Ansel Keys published a paper about sugar and atherosclerosis where he castrated a scientist as well as any scientist can castrate their fellow scientists, looking at every data in the world and saying it's hardly sugar compared to the potency of cholesterol and plaque, cholesterol in the serum, and the dietary influences that raise that. All that percolated along until a couple years ago when we did find out that there were a few scientists, not Ansel Keys, that did actually take some money from the sugar industry to taint to the conclusion of a very sophisticated paper in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1965 that probably 4 people in the world read, but it just really dirtied the waters, the importance of animal foods contributing to raising cholesterol and the importance of added sugar. What we do know in cardiology, and nobody reviews this better than Kim Williams, there are certainly epidemiologic studies that high levels of added sugar in the diet are associated with high levels of coronary artery disease, sugar-sweetened beverages. Is it that we gain weight and we become pre-diabetic, diabetic, and we become hypertensive and our triglycerides go up and become insulin resistant, or is it that sugar is directly toxic? And there's very little data that sugar is directly toxic to coronary arteries. It's an indirect mechanism. But the only reasonable conclusion and the joy of a whole food plant diet is it's naturally low in cholesterol. In fact, it's absent. It's naturally low in fats, generally, and it is certainly naturally low in added sugars if you avoid donuts and cookies. So food quality matters. You've heard that over and over, and so does sugar content. Not fruit, though. We all love fruit, I think. 3 minutes.
Okay, Dr. Katz had previously let me know he would be stepping out a little bit early. Okay, continuing. I have 5 more questions that each of you can answer one of them. The first one is, how do we protect our thyroid gland against thyroid issues? Number 2, what do you recommend for people with acid reflux? Number 3, what do you recommend for people who have eczema? Number 4, do you recommend mammograms? And if not, do you recommend thermographies? And number 5, what type of treatment would you advise for someone diagnosed with cancer? So the 5 questions again, where the first one was about your thyroid, second about acid reflux, third about eczema, fourth about whether you should get mammograms on a regular basis or at all, or thermography, and the 5th one is what type of treatment would you advise for someone diagnosed with cancer?
I'm going to leave with Dr. Katz with those 5 questions.
I'll talk about reflux since I'm actually a reflux surgeon, so I do a lot of reflux. Reflux is a complicated disease. It is amazing how many people have it, almost everybody. A lot of it has to do with physiology, with weight, with our diets. There's been some very good studies showing plant-based diet helps. The reason plant-based diet helps is because it's low in saturated fat. There's a muscle at the end of the esophagus called the lower esophageal sphincter. It is loosened by several things. It is loosened up by saturated fat, caffeine, alcohol. So that's why after dinner, a lot of people get really sick and get heartburn. Workup and treatment of this is very complex. We start with lifestyle changes like I do with everybody, plant-based diet, again, not vegan or vegetarian necessarily, but a whole food plant-based diet, low saturated fat, low caffeine, low alcohol, keep the bed elevated. I do use the medications. There's been a lot of debate lately over whether PPIs, which are Nexium, Prilosec, omeprazole, there's been some debates over whether they may contribute to all kinds of things, such as dementia, osteoporosis, things like that. The data.
But so if you're mostly eating whole foods and
say, oh my God, patient. And this
alcohol, so we need to be...
I think this is an important clarification because we have some people in our movement who are basically making claims that the lower levels of DHA, for example, in vegans, is a dangerous thing. It's already been decided. This is going to lead to disaster. We're all going to be demented or something like that. And this is a ridiculous statement to make. We simply don't know. And I think that when we don't know, we should say we don't know, because when we go out there with a great deal of bravado and make a claim about something that's patently false, what you're hoping is that there's not a smart person in the room who knows that it's patently false, and I don't think you can build a business or promote a movement that is dependent on not smart people listening to your message. So I appreciate that clarification. The other thing is you mentioned about diabetics, for example, having lower levels. And what we see is people who are sick have lower levels of a lot of things. There's a good deal of evidence that lower vitamin D levels are more a function of people being in poor health than anything else. There's one very good study that illustrates the point, lots of them, but this one's really crystal clear. People arriving at an emergency room in Georgia, hypoglycemic enough that they had to go to the hospital. Their vitamin D levels were 12.3 when they got there, and as soon as their glucose levels stabilized, they went up to 27.3, all right? So you can see the foolishness of doing intervention with vitamin D for diabetics, thinking it's somehow going to make them better because diabetics have low levels of vitamin D. So I think when we look at which comes first, is it the low vitamin D that's contributing to the disease, or the disease that has caused the low D, or the low DHA, whatever? We have to be careful that we're actually looking at what is causing what before we go out the deep end and say, oh my gosh, you're eating a vegan diet, you have to take these supplements, or you're pre-diabetic, so if you take these supplements, it's going to somehow help you. So I think that clarification needs to be made.
Do you guys, when I have vitamin D to try to decide whether or not someone needs vitamin D, one of the primary roles of vitamin D is to allow calcium absorption in the intestine. So I look at parathyroid hormone. Do you guys look at parathyroid hormone to see whether or not their vitamin D is actually affecting their calcium? Does anybody else do that? Am I the only one who checks parathyroid?
Only if they're hypercalcemic. I'll check it.
But I mean, if they're normal calcemic, but they've got a high parathyroid hormone, that means their body, because you can be normal calcemic and still be low in calcium. And so then I say, okay, well, your vitamin D needs to be supplemented in that situation. I don't. Yeah.
the review
2
showed
minutes
that
on sugar and heart disease. I had an opportunity to make the statement that was quoted on the Joe Rogan Experience September 2018 that I've been in heart arteries as an interventional cardiologist 15,000 times, and I've never scooped out sugar because you can actually do a procedure and scoop out plaque. 1913 was the first year Anichkow identified that in atherosclerosis there is cholesterol. Then we fed mice high cholesterol diets, they developed plaque. That led in many other data points and I think 11 Nobel Prizes to what's been called the cholesterol hypothesis, that serum cholesterol has a relationship to the development of the #1 killer men and women. Very seminal in this data was Ansel Keys. You've heard his name a couple times. Dr. Willett showed a slide from the 7-country study. I'll show another one tomorrow at lunchtime. And that was the leading hypothesis. And if you think the food wars are ugly now at times, in the 1960s came an Englishman named John Yudkin who had the contrary view. It's sugar, it's not cholesterol. Dr. Ansel Keys published a paper about sugar and atherosclerosis where he castrated a scientist as well as any scientist can castrate their fellow scientists, looking at every data in the world and saying it's hardly sugar compared to the potency of cholesterol and plaque, cholesterol in the serum, and the dietary influences that raise that. All that percolated along until a couple years ago when we did find out that there were a few scientists, not Ansel Keys, that did actually take some money from the sugar industry to taint to the conclusion of a very sophisticated paper in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1965 that probably 4 people in the world read, but it just really dirtied the waters, the importance of animal foods contributing to raising cholesterol and the importance of added sugar. What we do know in cardiology, and nobody reviews this better than Kim Williams, there are certainly epidemiologic studies that high levels of added sugar in the diet are associated with high levels of coronary artery disease, sugar-sweetened beverages. Is it that we gain weight and we become pre-diabetic, diabetic, and we become hypertensive and our triglycerides go up and become insulin resistant, or is it that sugar is directly toxic? And there's very little data that sugar is directly toxic to coronary arteries. It's an indirect mechanism. But the only reasonable conclusion and the joy of a whole food plant diet is it's naturally low in cholesterol. In fact, it's absent. It's naturally low in fats, generally, and it is certainly naturally low in added sugars if you avoid donuts and cookies. So food quality matters. You've heard that over and over, and so does sugar content. Not fruit, though. We all love fruit, I think.
Okay, Dr. Katz had previously let me know he would be stepping out a little bit early. Okay, continuing. I have 5 more questions that each of you can answer one of them. The first one is, how do we protect our thyroid gland against thyroid issues? Number 2, what do you recommend for people with acid reflux? Number 3, what do you recommend for people who have eczema? Number 4, do you recommend mammograms? And if not, do you recommend thermographies? And number 5, what type of treatment would you advise for someone diagnosed with cancer? So the 5 questions again, where the first one was about your thyroid, second about acid reflux, third about eczema, fourth about whether you should get mammograms on a regular basis or at all, or thermography, and the 5th one is what type of treatment would you advise for someone diagnosed with cancer?
I'm going to leave with Dr. Katz with those 5 questions.
I'll talk about reflux since I'm actually a reflux surgeon, so I do a lot of reflux. Reflux is a complicated disease. It is amazing how many people have it, almost everybody. A lot of it has to do with physiology, with weight, with our diets. There's been some very good studies showing plant-based diet helps. The reason plant-based diet helps is because it's low in saturated fat. There's a muscle at the end of the esophagus called the lower esophageal sphincter. It is loosened by several things. It is loosened up by saturated fat, caffeine, alcohol. So that's why after dinner, a lot of people get really sick and get heartburn. Working up the treatment of this is very complex. We start with lifestyle changes like I do with everybody. Plant-based diet. Again, not vegan or vegetarian necessarily, but a whole food plant-based diet. low saturated fat, low caffeine, low alcohol, keep the bed elevated. I do use the medications. There's been a lot of debate lately over whether PPIs, which are Nexium, Prilosec, omeprazole, there's been some debates over whether they may contribute to all kinds of things, such as dementia, osteoporosis, things like that. The data is very circumspect that they do that, though who wants to be on a pill all of your life? Certainly lifestyle changes and getting your weight under control helps. There are certain people where reflux is so bad that just about everything causes them to get severe heartburn. If they bend over, food comes up in their mouth. That's a different story. We do tests for that. I will do a scope where I put a camera down their mouth. Do they have irritation? Do they have changes in the esophageal mucosa that suggest that this acid reflux is really bad? Because that can lead to cancer. In fact, there's been a huge increase over the last 20 years in esophageal cancers of the reflux type instead of the old type, which is squamous cell. And a lot of those have to do with this changes in the esophagus called Barrett's changes. So if people have that, then we start getting more aggressive. That's when we start talking about surgeries to combat reflux. So I have kind of a whole protocol. It starts with lifestyle changes, medicines if needed. If you get really severe problems, we do endoscopy. We put a little, very smart little device inside the esophagus that measures how much acid is coming up, so I can get a quantitative score. If it's very high, then we may suggest surgery to fix that.
Ignore flop.
Yes, Dr. Mills is mentioning H. pylori. H. pylori is a bacteria that causes, not necessarily reflux, but it causes gastritis, like an irritation in the stomach. We've had a huge increase in H. pylori that has been both documented in the literature, but I have been seeing it crazy in my patients. And that will give you symptoms of reflux, but it's not true reflux, it's just irritation in the stomach. We do treat that with an antibiotic regimen that is now becoming resistant, so it's a little bit scary with the changes for H. pylori. It used to be that we had very good control of it with antibiotics. It's down to 7%.
One comment about the H. pylori. The humans have lived with H. pylori for hundreds of thousands of years, and eradicating it, I think, is not necessarily the best thing, because now we know that when you're sterile from H. pylori, it increases your risk of periodontitis around place. So that's sometimes the reason why people are treated.
Yeah, that's why I don't actually do biopsies in case I see a problem, because we have found H. pylori, but there's no gastritis. So what do you do with that? That's what people are inclined. So I don't do a biopsy unless I actually see it from the stomach, and then I'll treat it only for some inflammation.
I'll take mammography. But here's the problem with it. It does not reduce the risk of dying of breast cancer. Bottom line. And the only reason to have a screening test is either that it's going to prevent a morbidity of some sort, or it's going to prevent early death. So what you do get when you have mammograms, routine mammograms, and I'm talking about screening purposes here, is you find a lot of things that you really would be better off not knowing about, like ductal carcinoma in situ, which is not cancer. It's a risk factor for cancer. By itself, it doesn't mean very much, but it gets treated like cancer. Lumpectomies, increasingly a number of women getting mastectomies, often radiation treatment and hormonal therapy. It's astounding how much overtreatment there is. The worst part about it is that these women then become survivors who would have been survivors 5 years. They would have lived 5 years anyway. And it makes the cancer industry look like it's doing a whole lot better, because you take a bunch of people who don't have cancer, you treat them as if they have cancer, and the numbers get better, and they're all out racing for the cure and the whole 9 yards. It's just a despicable distortion of what should be going on. Thermography is no better. In fact, if anything, it suffers from more inclination to find even smaller abnormalities that are meaningless. And there's such inconsistency in the way that the thermograms are read. No two people come up with the same answer. The longer they look at various images, the worse that they get. So the studies are pretty abysmal. One just real short story I'll share with you. I was driving to work one morning, and I turned on the radio. I don't know what station, but somebody was talking on a talk show talking about the race for the cure in Central Park. And she was a famous person. I don't know who she was, but she was in charge of it. She was like the figurehead person. And the person interviewing her said, "Tell me your cancer story." And she said, "Well, I had a mammogram last February, and it was clear. And then in September, I found a lump, and it turned out to be stage 3 cancer. So fortunately, this happens all the time. So it's an integral cancer. These are the ones that grow in between mammograms. So unfortunately, thanks to modern medicine, I had treatment and chemotherapy, and now I'm fine. It's a year later, I don't even know she's fine yet. But in any case, at the end of the interview, after all about the race in the park this Sunday, the interviewer says, "What advice do you have for women?" And I just almost drove my car off the road. She said, "Well, you know how we are. We always want to take care of ourselves. And so take the time and go get that mammogram. It'll save your life." And I thought, listen, lady, you just told everybody about how you found the cancer a few months after the mammogram told you you were clear. And it doesn't save your life. So here, one last thing I want to say about this. One of the most insidious things about all this screening, with the exception of cervical cancer screening, which really does work, is people drink the medical Kool-Aid and think that they're protected. All right? So basically what happens is they get their mammogram results back and it's clear. And they think, you know what, someone in the back of the mind, eating cheese pizza and having wine for dinner every night is working out pretty well for me. While I'm sitting on the couch, I'll do it for another year, and then I'll go get tested and we'll see if I'm still getting away with it. And we've got to stop doing that. A clear mammogram is, first of all, it doesn't mean anything. But the second thing is this type of incessant screening is giving people a very false sense of security about their health. And it's a very disingenuous, destructive thing that we're doing.
I will say this, because in a prior entity, I used to be a breast surgeon, and I quit because I could not stand the mammogram. But it wasn't any kind of insidious. I was cutting breasts out medical legally. Like, as soon as you get that mammogram and it says you've got this, you have to cut it out because otherwise you will be sued. The lawsuits in breast surgery, and I could not stand all the. It turned out we were looking back at our data and we found I think it was like 6% actual breast cancer of all the biopsies and breast tissue that I was taking out. And so it's a tough world. I don't know the right answer. I mean, MRIs are extremely sensitive. So they will pick up the cancer, but they will also pick up 100 other things that aren't cancer.
Right.
And I found myself whittling away at his breasts until I was like, gosh, you should just get a mastectomy. Also, I didn't get sued, so I quit.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about the cancer question. First of all, I think it's important to understand we talk about cancer as though it's one thing. And cancer is not one thing. Cancers arrive in different tissues. And cancers of different tissues have different characteristics. So you have blood cancers, like leukemias, which are very different from solid masses. And even within the category of solid tumors, a solid tumor in your lungs carries a very different prognosis from a solid tumor in the testes, prostate, and so on. So the number one thing we have to understand is that cancer is not just one disease, and you can't just assume that one approach is going to fit every type of cancer. Now that being said, the question was, well, how do you treat cancer? What would you recommend? All right, in the interest of transparency, I am a critical care doctor, not an oncologist. So one of the first things I would do is look for an oncologist I respected to refer the person to. But what the question I think is getting at is, what do I think is the best approach to it? And I want to share some stories from some people that I've met to kind of illustrate what I think. 2 years ago, I was invited to Ireland to speak at the Reg Fest. Afterwards, I met this young man. He's Greek. He told me that he had been in the Greek army, training for the Olympics. He was lifting weights. He was a 400-meter runner, and he thought he had to eat, mainly red meat, which is what he was doing until he started noticing abdominal pain, blood in the stool, got worked up, and he had stage 3 colon cancer, a large mass with evidence of metastasis. And I was expecting him to say, I then had surgery and changed my diet. That's not what he said. What he said was, in essence, I eventually became completely raw vegan. I did not do surgery. I did not do chemo. I did not do radiation. And over a 6 to 8 month period, the tumor regressed and all the cancer markers went to 0. And at that point, he was 7 years old. He effectively cured himself with diet change. Last February, I met a woman down in Alabama who, in 1996, was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. Stage 3 breast cancer, according to conventional medical dogma, is a death sentence. Women are told, we can treat you, we'll give you a lumpectomy or a mastectomy, followed by radiation and chemo, which will buy you some time, but eventually the cancer is going to come back and it's going to kill you. She had a pecan-sized lump that was removed, and 11 of 17 lymph nodes were positive for the cancer. She had stage 3 breast cancer. She decided that after her lumpectomy, she was going to go completely vegan. She went raw vegan for about at least 6 months, and over that time, her tumor markers went to 0, and as I said, this was 1996. This woman is down there teaching plant-based classes in Alabama. I just met another woman who was diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer 3 years ago. She actually went to the Hippocrates Institute. I think she had the initial mass removed, but then she became completely vegan. Again, she was raw for about 8 months before she started weaning cooked foods back in, and she's 3 years out and by all accounts is cancer-free. Met another gentleman who in 2013 was diagnosed with stage 4 liver cancer. Told, dude, you got 6 months, get your life together, you're not going to be here. He went to see a vegan practitioner in Washington, D.C., and put him on a vegan diet, again, raw for a minimum of 6 months. And Frank is here, still alive, cancer-free, I guess 7 years out. So what I'm saying is that there clearly is great power within plant foods to help treat cancer. Now, can I tell any given individual that this is going to cure your cancer? No, but what the data do show, and this is just general medical data, that those who change their diet post-diagnosis, given all cancers, to a diet that includes more or mostly plant foods and fruits and vegetables, that it will increase their overall survival. It also increases time to their cancer-free survival. So we know, even within the conventional medical literature, that plant foods are having an effect. And there are these admittedly anecdotal cases that I just mentioned of people who actually, by all appearances, were able to cure themselves of cancer by using a plant-based diet. My point is this: plant foods have power. They have potent anti-cancer properties. This we know. I'm sorry, I got my chin down. This we know from, again, a number of different studies. We need more research. We need to figure out what the hell is happening in these people who do have these cures. And what is it about, particularly a raw plant food diet, that seems to have such bioactivity against cancer cells? And if anybody came to me with cancer, I would talk to them about the various options, conventional modalities, whether, like, if I had been in the Greek gentleman's shoes, I would have said, cut out what you can cut out, and then I'm going to be going raw. But he was bold enough to just do it with diet alone. Obviously, it's each individual's decision, but whatever they did, I would strongly urge them to be on a strictly plant-based diet, because we know that animal protein and animal food feeds cancer. And the analogy I use is, if your house catches fire, it makes no sense to have the fire department in the front yard pouring water on it while you're in the backyard throwing kerosene into the house. It's just going to eventually burn down. And so when you get a cancer, you've got to stop doing the things that are feeding those cancer cells, causing the inflammation that's driving the cancer, and that's an animal food center diet.
But I would say this, because of course I say that, but as a cancer surgeon who's done some, man, please go and see an oncologist and don't say that. You know, if an oncologist was here, they would go crazy with the anecdote on the colon. I've seen colon people come in and, oh my God, they just got their colon surgery done earlier.
As I said, I would have done the surgery, and I'm not recommending this. I'm saying that what it shows is that plant foods have power against cancer, but that I would never, and I said, the first thing I would do is recommend someone to an oncologist that I respect. But you know, it has to be the individual's decision.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at Ornish's study with prostate cancer, he took the blood of the vegans and dripped it on the agar gel, cancer cells, and it killed them. So there's definitely an advantage to vegan diet, but there's, again, there's certain diseases. If I got pancreatic cancer, I'll try anything. Right. Give me what you got. I used to do a surgery where we cut out the pancreas. I wouldn't get that done. But there are certain surgeries, colon cancer and breast cancer, that are very treatable now. The rates of cancer death from breast cancer and colon cancer are going down dramatically with some of our treatments. If I had glioblastoma, yeah, I mean, that's safe for you. What should I do? But there are situations where I definitely would still go and see an oncologist.
I also know of a vegan woman who had stage 4 ovarian cancer, which is essentially uniformly fatal. She had the debulking surgeries, she had the intraperitoneal chemotherapy, she did all of that, plus she went raw vegan, and she is like at least 12 years out, which is, again, anecdotal but unheard of. So my fundamental point is just to say plant foods have power, and that whatever modality of treatment you use, you've got to make sure that being 100% plant-based is part of it.
Great.
Not to be the Debbie Downer, there was a published study in the urology literature 2 weeks ago of 400 men with prostate cancer, which is about 4 times larger than Dr. Ornish's study published in 2005. The setup was, if plants are so good, the control group should try and eat 5, and the intervention group should try and eat 10 servings a day. There wasn't any difference in outcome recurrence. But they didn't ask them to reduce dairy, so it may be that that's not enough, right? But it is, it is out there, and the headlines are all over that vegetable-heavy diet had no impact on cancer. It's just brand new and still relevant. Thyroid, 2 minutes, maybe 1 minute. I'm not an endocrinologist. However, there's hyperthyroidism, Graves' disease, and autoimmune disease. Maybe you've been radiated as a child. There are people that take excess iodine and drive the thyroid into a kind of a manic state. So if you're supplementing with iodine, it's about 150 micrograms a day, not 15 grams a day.
Flyers are too
One of
hard.
my patients recently just did, and induced hyperthyroidism. But the relationship between diet and Graves' disease, I don't think is well known. Autoimmune diseases may be sick gut. Plant diets may be better for leaky gut. These are all concepts. I don't think it's been tested. Hypothyroidism studied in the Adventist Health Study, where again they segregated vegan versus lacto-ovo versus pesco-vegetarian versus omnivores, was lower. The most common thyroid disease, hypothyroidism, was less frequent in the vegan population in Loma Linda. There's one woman who ate 4 pounds of bok choy a day reported in the literature that developed goitrogen and myxedema, coma, severe hypothyroidism. Don't eat 4 pounds of bok choy a day, apparently. There's not a lot of cases, even though there's a whole lot of discussion about cruciferous vegetables and thyroid health. I mean, it's the rainbow. It's rotate. It's don't eat any single food to excess would be a pretty good principle.
Just one thing I'll add to that. High estrogen levels are related to hypothyroidism that is an autoimmune. And so the relationship between eating a plant-based diet is that even before the weight loss starts, the estrogen levels come down, and I think that's one of the mechanisms for the positive effect.
And maybe xenoestrogens, all that you're getting from animal products directly.
I think the last item on the menu here is eczema. And eczema is definitely not my area of expertise. I could take a stab at it and say that I think we need a very anti-inflammatory diet and make sure we're not eating things we're sensitive
300.
to. And I think, Pam, you could probably say a lot more about it. But anti-inflammatory diet, of course, means you want to reduce pro-inflammatory foods like meat with a lot of heme iron, for example, and anti-inflammatory foods, colorful fruits and vegetables, lots of herbs and spices, fermented foods, tea, all sorts of other plant matter, and in a very unprocessed form. And I think that's what we've been talking about. That's all what we're trying to do. But certainly for some people, I'm sure it's just a sensitivity to some food, and it could be almost anything. And so it's not always easy to figure out what it is. An elimination diet may be the answer, but I think you could probably add a lot more.
I'll just add a couple of things. First of all, eczema is a pretty good predictor of future autoimmune disease. So if you can stop it, it often prevents more bad things from happening. The two food intolerances that are most common is dairy and gluten. And if you take those foods out of the diet, follow Brenda's guidelines for an anti-inflammatory diet, and take high-dose probiotics, usually you can get rid of it. People who are compliant do get rid of it, and often that's just the end of their immune dysfunction journey.
You use a special probiotic. When you say high-dose probiotic, what do you use?
It depends on the person. If you're a practitioner and you're going to use these in practice, I always tell people, find a company that you have confidence in, that doesn't put their stuff on the shelves, because the longer it sits, the more it degrades. It really doesn't have much to do with refrigeration, it's just kind of on the shelf. So we found a company in Canada that ships the stuff to us the next day.
But do you order like a certain, like in your eczema patient, a certain microbiome?
Yeah, well,
weight loss a different one?
Well, it depends on what's going on with them. So, for example, a really gassy, bloated person, if you give them a high-dose probiotic with some type of prebiotic in it, they won't be able to leave the house. They'll be so miserable. So, you do have to tailor the product to the person in terms of what you recommend to them. And
What about bacterial strains?
Yeah.
Bifidobacter for...
Yeah, you start with the two-strain product, because the Bifidobacteria and Lactobacillus are the two strains that seed the gut in the beginning. So we get some of these people who've had 24 rounds of antibiotics and they've taken prednisone, they take NSAIDs every day. I mean, they have nothing. So for those people, we start with, if they're in really bad shape and uncomfortable from a GI perspective, we'll start with a low-dose two-strain product and then work our way up from there until we get to medical food. But I think it's best to get these from practitioners and suppliers who do studies on their products. I don't like structured funding things. I like companies who do research on their products.
Do you use
Well, you can't really use fecal transplants in the United States legally unless you have other to treat C. diff. We've had people go to Thailand and get fecal transplants because they have the money to do it. Unfortunately, there's a lot of pressure on the FDA from the drug companies who finance the FDA to not allow this to go forward. There's really not much that can go wrong. One study that was done on autistic children, for example, showed that fecal transplant within 12 weeks allowed for something like 14 months of, within just a few weeks, 14 months of developmental gain. Because autistic children have, it's a gastrointestinal problem to a certain extent. So it should be allowed, should be available to everybody, but there are ways to do everything you can to make sure that it's not. I have physician friends who are gastroenterologists who would be happy to do fecal transplant on lots of patients, but are just not allowed to.
Okay. 1 minute on these answers.
We did not adhere to the 1 minute, Steve.
So these are really 1 minute, for real. This is almost a yes or no question, just to get these in. Yes or no, no more than 1 minute. Should women going through menopause take hormones or bioidentical hormones or any type of medicine to help them? That's question 1. Question 2, should we avoid heating oils? Do they turn into carcinogens when you heat an oil? In other words, should you put your olive oil on your quinoa after it's cooked as opposed to cooking with it? Question 3, What is an acrylamide? Does it mean that we shouldn't eat cooked food? Question 4, do you recommend colonoscopies? Question 5, do you recommend we learn from some of these companies about our genes and our DNA that'll analyze our DNA and genes to let us know about potential health issues? Just 1 minute on each.
Yep, on the colonoscopies.
Yes, on the colonoscopy. Yes, on the colonoscopy. But there is Cologuard if you're very low risk and have had a negative colonoscopy, so we're still evolving that.
There's not a single randomized trial that has ever shown that colonoscopy reduces the risk of dying of colon cancer, and Canadians took it off their list in 2016 as a result.
I will tell you that I have saved people's lives like you cannot believe with colonoscopy, like unbelievably so. And a vegan too. Like
I believe you.
I mean, like so much so that I can't, like they would have died.
I understand that.
I'm
But
getting a
here's-
colonoscopy next
But
week.
here's the thing. What we have to do is put the right data in front of the patient and let them decide. And it would be disingenuous to say that colonoscopies reduces the risk of dying of colon cancer because there are no studies saying that. And it is okay to say there are no studies saying it. Somebody may still opt to get the colonoscopy because of family history or whatever, but the bottom line is it is important to tell people the truth. That's all I'm saying. I'm sure the colonoscopy does save some lives. And by the way, there are people out there, every time I give a talk, somebody stands up and says, my sister-in-law's best friend's neighbor's cousin's mother, it saved her life to have a mammogram. I believe that's true. But when somebody is sitting in front of you saying, should I do it? I think we have to put data in front of them and let them decide.
I mean, there's some good data with Cologuard, but with colonoscopy, I mean, I can't tell you, I could take a tiny little polyp so easily. A big mass that it will grow into is frightful.
I agree.
And I've got a long history of, I can't get your colonoscopy. I can't emphasize. I don't even like Cologuard. Get your colonoscopy.
I'll take the gene question in 1 minute. There certainly are no randomized studies that indicate your health will be better and you live longer if you have extra samples drawn from saliva, blood, or whatever. I am a participant in research in San Diego, a thing called Human Longevity Inc. They published results in a very prestigious journal last week called Proceeding National Academy of Science, suggesting a more aggressive approach identified earlier disease and leads to better outcome. It's a hypothesis. It's called precision medicine. If you knew your genetic risk was higher for renal cell carcinoma or for colorectal cancer, Alzheimer's, would you make some changes or see a genetic counselor? But it's a hypothesis. And I think we don't know. I mean, I've been through it. You can now get a panel of cancer genes, heart disease, pharmacogenetic genes for $200 by spitting in a cup. It was $2,000, $20,000 just a couple years ago. So it's being priced down where it's possible for many to do it. It's your own. Do you want to know? Do you not want to know? Do you want to know if your gun is loaded and you have to be careful not to pull the trigger or not? And there are what called shared decision-making with patients. I favor it. I do a lot of it.
Gigi.
I guess I'll address heating oil. First of all, if you do use oils, they have a smoke point, and so all oils are not created equal. Whenever an oil smokes, you are producing products of oxidation that are potentially carcinogenic. So acrylenes, aldehydes, all sorts of things. And so you really don't want oils to smoke. For a lot of oils, especially if they're fresh pressed oils with a lot of particles in them, they smoke at a very low temperature, including coconut oil, by the way, that's an organic, more natural, there are particles that will smoke at a much lower temperature than a more refined oil. So if you're cooking, I'm really and truly probably best if you use oils to not cook them, but if you are cooking them, don't let them get to a smoke point.
Bioidentical hormone, yes?
I'll take HRT. I don't recommend it, and bioidentical hormones have not been proven to be safer. And a new study just came out. There are lots of studies. This is just one more. But this one shows that if you take hormones, either estrogen by itself, progesterone and estrogen combination, whatever it is, it increases the risk of breast cancer in a dose-dependent manner. The longer you take it, the higher the risk. And I've never had anybody sitting in my office who said, you know I have breast cancer now, but all those years without hot flashes, it was so worth it. Nobody says that.